All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded virtual panel discussion today entitled Questionable Research Practices Within Contextual Behavioral Science and Concerns and Potential Ways Forward. And my name is Sam Spencer. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii and soon to be postdoc at Baylor College of Medicine. And I'm very excited to be chairing this panel discussion today. And before we get into the discussion and hear from our esteemed panelists, I wanted to provide just a short 5-minute or so introduction to the topics and just to orient everyone to what we're going to be getting into today. So to provide some context, broadly speaking, meta-science concerns have been a developing line of research in the 2010s in this past decade. And a lot of this has been due to what's known as the replicability crisis, in the sense that many findings in psychological science broadly were found to not be replicable in subsequent research, which was a big eye-opening issue. And such issues are especially problematic in the sense that achieving replicability is really important for making conceptual and empirical advances in science. Some have argued that questionable research practices play a role in some of the issues with replication. So defined, questionable research practices are any type of scientist behavior, whether intentional or unintentional, at any stage of the research process, spanning from study design to dissemination of findings in journal articles, behaviors that undermine the validity of research findings and diminish our confidence in conclusions drawn from such research. Some examples of QRPs, or questionable research practices, include methodological concerns, such as running a large number of analyses without statistically correcting p-values, p-hacking, hypothesizing after results are known, parking, and running a large number of analyses and selectively reporting only positive findings in articles. Some related concerns involve a lack of transparency in the dissemination of findings and slow progress in terms of researcher willingness to share data and protocols. This lack of transparency is especially problematic in the sense that it hinders proliferation of the open science practices, which have demonstrated quite a bit of promise for reducing questionable research practices. But unfortunately, despite the fact that most scientists laudably hold values of truth and validity in the pursuit of knowledge, but unfortunately, questionable research practices continue to proliferate, perhaps due to problematic contingencies within academia that reinforce volume of publications, and in essence, promoting a pursuit of publishing it instead of getting it right. However, much of the work with questionable research practices has focused on methodology and reporting practices. Measurement is another area that's very closely related to questionable research practices that we're going to be touching on a little bit in this panel, hopefully. Some example of questionable measurement practices involve an over-reliance on Cronbach's alpha as a proxy for good psychometric properties at the expense of validity. As well as conceptual challenges in construct validity, perhaps as an example, conflating measurement of process variables with outcome variables in psychotherapy research, as well as excessive use of self-report questionnaires and a lack of transparency in the reporting of measurement practices in journal articles. So as we narrow down all of this and we ask, how do we apply this to CBS? So while the replicability crisis has been broadly considered in many areas of science, it's still a really relevant issue in CBS, as attested to by the presence of this panel here. And essentially, CBS is not immune from these issues. And this is especially apparent within the realm of measurement, and looking at CBS-related measures such as the IRAP as a measure of relational framing, and the AAQs as a measure of psychological flexibility, and the lines of work that have investigated and critically appraised those measures. So one last note that I wanted to make here is just on this notion of intellectual humility and amiable skepticism, in the sense that approaching this topic area with those sensitivities in mind, I think, is really important. And being able to sort of bring the psychological flexibility and compassion to this topic as scientists is especially important, in the sense that transparency and open science involve a degree of vulnerability, and intellectual humility, which I believe are necessary ingredients for scientific progress. So with that in mind, I'm very excited to have a wide range of panelists here spanning diverse roles, training backgrounds, and career stages. And with that in mind, I will now ask all of the panelists to introduce themselves, their name, where they're from, and perhaps a little bit about what got them interested in meta-science concerns, related issues. Nick, maybe I'll toss it to you. Looks like you're right next to me on the screen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sam, for putting this together and for the invitation of being able to be a part of the panel. My name's Nicholas Bergonia. I am an assistant professor of psychological science at Texas Tech University. I'm very much interested in what makes counseling and other interventions effective for mental illnesses. And so, yes, very happy to be here. Ian's right next to me, so I'll pass it to Ian next.
I'm Ian Hussey. I'm a postdoc working at Ruhr University Bochum in Germany. I did my PhD in a CBS lab, and I've since gravitated to doing meta science full time. So I'm at the intersection of the two of them.
Hi, I'm Jason Luoma. I'm currently CEO and researcher at Portland Psychotherapy, where we fund our own research through the revenue we bring in through the organization. And I've been involved with CBS and ACT since before the first ACT book wrote. I think I'm part of the reference to different stages of your career in this comment. And I got interested in this, just seeing the same problems that in meta science that we've seen across science in general. And I saw them throughout my career in CBS as well, and just thought, like, we need to learn from this and import this into CBS thinking. That's how I got involved.
I'll hop in. I'm Eric Lee. I'm an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University. And how did I get into this? I don't know. I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm glad these conversations are happening. I guess I got into this the same way everyone else did, of just finding out, all the things that we've been taught and the ways that we approach these ideas and some of the ideas we have in psychology are surprisingly, like maybe not what we think they are. And as I dig into it more, I'm interested in doing better and finding ways to do better as a scientist and to help psychology as a field move forward. And so that's why I'm interested.
I'm Clarissa Ong. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toledo. I was thinking about how I got interested. I actually think it was academic Twitter and kind of people tweeting, and Ian was one of those people, actually. And I think, like, kind of like everyone said, drawing the conclusion that, as much as we're doing cool research, if the foundation of that is wobbly, then no matter how cool the research is, it kind of is very limited in what it can help us learn about, how we want to help people. So I think that was like scary, but also exciting. So yeah, that's it.
So those are all very inspiring introductions. I think that really sets the frame nicely for the potential impact that this discussion might have on our field and trainees and researchers across the whole spectrum. So with that in mind, I was kind of hoping that we could start with a broad question that would kind of help us narrow this into the realm of CBS. And in the sense that I've been reading a lot about open science and the replicability crisis in psychological science broadly. And it seems that a lot of the attention early on were in the realms of social, developmental, and cognitive psychology, with clinical psych and then CBS getting a little bit less attention. And I'm sort of curious, I'd love to hear what the panelists think about what aspects of this larger meta-science replicability crisis, what aspects of that seem to be most applicable and relevant to contextual behavioral science today?
you rather we jump in or raise our hands?
Feel free. Maybe if you all want to go around and share, whatever flows easiest, I guess.
Maybe I'll just throw out a simple short answer, which is all of it. When we had a panel discussion about this in Seville in 2017, one of the things that was brought up and followed in the years after was that maybe we needed to develop a bespoke meta-science specific for CBS, some super specific CBS-orientated solutions. And what the few years between then and now seem to have revealed is that that's not the case. CBS has some really lovely, appetitive, distinctive features to it that draw me to it. But as a scientific method, we have far more in common with other areas of science than we have difference. So there are so many great initiatives that we can take off the shelf and apply whole cloth without having to reinvent the wheel. So I would say all of it.
Yeah, I would just agree with that, and that like I think we'd be fooling ourselves to say that we're not swimming in the same water as every other scientific field. You know, this did certainly start in social psychology, but we're finding that it's relevant in, you know, harder sciences and biology and nutrition science. And I mean, you name it, as we look at these things, we're recognizing that these problems are everywhere. And so, yeah, I think we'd be fooling ourselves to think that we're that special.
I mean, not to mention that, what, 90% plus of the research that's published on CBS, you know, processes and ideas is done by people who have very little training in CBS, really. They don't understand the philosophy of science. They don't understand the tradition. They don't understand behavior analysis and some of the elements that come out of that. And they're publishing on these topics. And so they're really publishing from a mainstream perspective, which was what open science was really meant to develop, to address. So maybe if you're one of that tiny slice of people, of researchers in CBS who, you know, are really well versed in CBS and functional contextualism, okay, maybe there's some esoteric argument you can make about these don't apply, but it still applies to the other 95% of people. And that's the, you know, when we're starting to bring the data together, like that's what matters, is that bulk of the evidence across all these different contexts and all these labs. And so really this is what open science practices and meta science practices that are being promoted out there were meant to handle. And it's the best thinking of the best people and with tons of funding all around the world who are trying to come up with the best solutions to science problems. And for us to think like that we should ignore those is just, I just think is supremely arrogant, honestly. And, you know, I think we need to pay attention to what the rest of science is saying are like problems and acknowledge that those are showing up in our backyard as well. And we're starting to develop more and more evidence base that we need to address some of these things. I've been on two papers recently that were both kind of taking some of these critical perspectives of CBS and thinking about open science and transparency practices and considering how to apply them in the realm of contextual behavioral science. And we see things like some of these very basic practices, like say pre-registration, that seems to add a lot of value. So one of the most central basic practices that's out there seems to add a lot of value. We did an audit of JCBS, which isn't where everything in CBS is published, but it's the, you know, the most central journal, arguably. And when we audited that, we saw that only 6% of the articles in just the last, you know, a couple of years ago, only 6% of the articles were pre-registering. So it's very, very rare that a practice like that is, you know, one of the most common kind of promoted ones is really being very rarely used inside our community. And when we looked at other common practices, we saw very low rates of implementation of those as well. Like data sharing was incredibly low. And, you know, we talk about ourselves as an open community that, you know, promotes sharing and things. And then like when we actually look at like what's the rate of data sharing inside JCBS, it was like 4% or something. I could pull it out, but it was like 4% or 6% said they'd be willing to share their data. So 94% didn't even say they were willing to share their data. And then we know when you actually do studies and you look at like of the people who say they're willing to share their data, you actually contact them, like it's a tiny portion of them that actually share their data. So now we're probably talking like 2% or 1%. It's just, it's there's a lot of stuff that is clearly not part of our culture around CBS research that we could start to import.
I might just very quickly add to that I have a manuscript under review in a preprint that asks exactly that question. So JCBS, the Psych Record, other journals have data sharing statement requirements now that say you must share it upon request. So I went and asked people, and it's about 17% I found will actually say it, even though they have pre-promised as a condition of publishing in the journal that they'll send you their data. When you ask them, it's actually lower than people who didn't promise that they would share it with you, which was terrifying. So
I have definitely want other people to say, just real quick, I want other people to say stuff, but just to add, and it's not to say people are bad people, right? Like there are lots of reasons why people don't share data. It takes, you didn't prepare it right, so you can't, like, it's hard to get it back. It takes hours to reconstruct it. The student who created the data set is gone. You know, there's lots of reasons. It's not like those are bad people and then bad people that aren't doing these practices. There's a lot of reasons why people are doing it that aren't about impugning anybody. It's just that there's a culture that's been created that gets in the way of good science. How do you choose that? So I would be quiet now. Said a lot of
I think, Sam, like part of your question was almost a bit about like CBS exceptionalism, that somehow like maybe there's something so different. And I think like kind of what Jason was saying, I think it's almost the opposite, that rather than being immune, I feel like the values that or the mission that CBS espouses means that almost like we should be more likely to follow these practices, because I think ACPS, talks about being pro-social and, doing good science that's going to help people. Like, it almost feels like if we are going to be special in some way, not that I'm saying other fields don't do this, like it should be more toward open science. I think it's like kind of embedded in the values that all of us agree on, I think.
Nick, thoughts, or do you want to move on to the next question here? I have some ideas of where we might go after this.
I'm just listening to all this, and I just want to say I agree. I think in some ways we probably can move on to the next question. I wouldn't disagree that I think open science is essential and something that we talk about. I know in my own research, I've tried to be a little bit better about some of these things myself, but I think I think I have some questions and some thoughts that get deeper into our actual research and the CBS and ACT and RFT models and frameworks. And I think I would hope that that's where our conversation can go next. So I guess, Sam, I'll take it back to you.
It's like a great introduction to that, Nick. And it sort of speaks to...
Could I just add something before we move on?
Oh, go ahead.
Just, sorry, I really like your point on values, right? So one of the things in my really broad reading over the last few years has been to go back to really old behavioral texts and discover how much that replicability and concerns about it and data sharing and all of these values have been embedded in our community for so long. So I've always thought that it was a shame that we're not at the forefront of promoting these things. Sidman's research storybook has in chapter 1 or chapter 2 entire sections on data sharing and the need for replication. And it seems that we've forgotten these things a little bit along we go. So I think I agree with you. We could be exceptional. We could also appeal to a really rich history of espousing these values. And it's a shame that we're not leading that conversation more. And I think there's still time to get there and contribute, because so much of the mainstream forgets that the behavioral literature even exists. I think there's a lot of rich knowledge to tap there. And yeah, if we are going to be exceptional at all, as you say, it would be better in a positive direction.
Such a good point. It really does speak to how getting it right is sometimes undervalued to getting it published, in the sense when you think, could you be productive writing all 3 papers rather than taking it back to the basics and consulting the roots, like you said, Ian, or I even wrote down Sidman's book to dig into that. That's great. And so I was kind of thinking, Nick jogged to this point a little bit about this issue of like, how do we translate theoretical constructs in ACT and CBS? How do we translate that to valid measurement, and sort of examining the theory based on measurement? And The Luoma and Arch et al. Paper discusses this a little bit in terms of like a lot of the measures we have of psychological flexibility. They really haven't adequately tested the theoretical model of one factor with 6 subfactors. And I know this issue exists within RFT as well, although I'm not as familiar with that, but I've been reading about the IRAP and challenges in that. And I really would be curious to see, I know this issue is a little bit more focused than the meta science stuff, but I think it's still relevant. And I really would be curious to hear what people think about challenges with the possible reification of these constructs and how we can improve measurement to really test these theoretical models.
I'm hesitant to always be the one to jump in first, so please someone do beat me to it. One thing as a starting point is I think it's really good to be reflective and notice how much measurement work is published in JCBS. So many communities, I think, start with, well, measurement is either a little tricky or it's not at the center of my interests or it's hard to publish. And yeah, it can be a little tricky, but it's not hard to publish in CBS. And I think this is a cultural kind of norm for us that we have yet to make the most of, right? Because if you can get the work out there, clearly you can access reinforcers for doing it. Like that's establishing those reinforcers is often a tricky first step. And that's a little easier for CBS. But like so much of science and especially psychology, we arguably face a measurement crisis and a validation crisis, and this work is not done enough. Even a little bit more of this work at the front end could save years or decades of work at the back end of either not chasing down avenues that weren't that useful in the end, or getting it wrong and having to correct that, which always takes an order of magnitude more work. So a lot of the work, the things I've written about with, for example, the IRAP and the issues that I see in it, almost all of them were knowable and correctable in the first handful of years had we just deployed our skills slightly differently, right? There's only so many hours in the day. And if we had concentrated on getting measurement right first, not just reliability, but like knowing what is being measured in these tasks, the broader validity question, we could have done a lot more with that since. I think measures can get used a lot completely in the absence of that validity evidence. And so even from the sort of pseudo-economic argument of, are we allocating our finite resources well, and maybe the more active one of in the service of our stated scientific goals, I think simply doing more measurement work and focusing on getting it right early has really immense payoffs, right? There is not a fantastic tradition of measurement in most psych departments. It's left to like the quantitative folks, but that knowledge is out there. It's accessible even to people trained as like behavior analysts. You know, I should be the least measurement focused guy around, but it's something I've acquired, and it does have really great payoffs rather in what you can do with it down the line and the work that you can save from being done that wasn't great in the first place.
Not to put you on the spot, Nick, but I really would enjoy hearing your perspective. I know we've been doing some measurement related work with the experiential avoidance as a sub process in the ACT model. And I think that your background, a little bit peripheral within CBS, I think your perspective is really useful in that regard.
Yeah, well, I want to say I agree with Ian's thoughts there, especially about measurement and the importance of measurement. I teach stats here in our department, and it's to our clinical and counseling and other students. And you can tell it's obviously not something that, at least from the applied perspective, is very, it's not everyone's favorite subject, so to speak. It's like, I'll do this just because I have to. And I feel like that to some degree, that sort of mentality has led to some of these problems. And so you mentioned the Arch paper, and I broke that out yesterday and re-reviewed it, and I had some concerns regarding the broader ACT model. The concern being that, like, if we have never actually appropriately measured the constructs within the model, how do we know there's even an ACT in some ways? You know, that's kind of where my mind goes. And I think in order to, you know, we have over 1,000 randomized control trials now reported of ACT versus other conditions, many of which are waitlist, but other types of therapy. But if we have never actually appropriately developed measures that accurately measure the model, how do we know it's, you know, you can see one question leads to another. How do we know? And maybe an example of this is when I was on internship, I had a supervisor who was very much an applied. He was not a researcher, but he said he like did ACT. He's one of those, I think Jason mentioned, like 95% of the mainstream who wasn't like a traditional CBS person, but said they were ACT-ish, you know. And the way he approached ACT was probably not the same way I think some of us would approach ACT, but we just called it ACT, right? You know, it's just ACT, values, you know. I start to wonder, you know, how much do we actually know, even though we say we have 1,000 randomized control trials? I think, kind of to Ian's point, there needs to be serious reconsideration and development of measures that perhaps we could say accurately measure the model, and perhaps revise the model accordingly, or maintain the model. I'm not sure. You mentioned our work. We're developing an experiential avoidance measure that we think was that there's a whole problem, I think, with that line in itself, but there are other dimensions. And so I think there needs to be serious reconsideration with the research we have, with the measures we have, and to Ian's point, we need seriously better measurement.
And I wanted to add to Ian's point too about like kind of the front loading the work and having the payoff later. I think you mentioned like an economic model, and I think if we think about it in terms of opportunity cost, and I think that kind of highlights the gravity of spending time doing things that might not be helpful later. And in addition to like our time, I think considering like the participants' time, like if we think of all the hours that participants have spent producing data that we can't really use, it's like quite a sad thought, I think. And so going back to Sam, your question about like testing back, like the factor structure of psychological flexibility. So Eric and I are working on this project looking at like content overlap among psychological flexibility and inflexibility measures. So even before that, like we found, and Eric can talk more about the results, but basically very little overlap. So in all the measures like the compact, the AAQ, Cyflex, I don't know, all the others, they overlap very little, right? So even before we're talking about like validating, like if it's a 6-part factor structure or whatever, it's like, are we even measuring the same thing? Does this construct even measure, or does it even cover that what we think psychological flexibility comprises in theory? So I think it's almost like every time I think about measurement issues, like, oh no, this is it. It's like, no, even before that, there's this other thing. Like, oh, even before that, there's this other thing. So I guess I'm curious where people think like, where do we even start, like with, taking a kind of good faith step forward in validation research.
Yeah, it does sort of make me think and have a lot of pause when interpreting these 1,000 studies, as you say, Nick. And it kind of raises this interesting question of equipoise, where it's like, how do we avoid, okay, let's completely invalidate the findings from all 1,000 studies. versus on the other end, just completely buying them all completely without critical thought. And I think there's a tendency to want to go to one extreme or the other. I think that balancing is important.
In terms of concrete steps, I think that, did anyone see the recent Jingle Jangle paper on mindfulness? It's only out like a week. No. I think that provides a great template. There are not a really large amount yet, but it's a nice template for work to be done. I would love to see the same done for like the AAQ, the compact, things like this, right? So very simply speaking, it was news to me when I learned about measurement, but jingle and jangle fallacies are everywhere. Jingle is the fallacy that two names with the same sounding names, like the jingle, measure the same thing. So while both of these measures have experiential avoidance in their name, so they must both measure experiential avoidance. Or equally, jangle fallacy is that because they have different names, they must measure different things. This is a distress scale and this is an AAQ, so they can't be the measure of the same thing, even though validation evidence suggests, unfortunately, the AAQ in large part measures distress. So there's so much scope, not specifically within just the AAQ and things, but really nuts and bolts measurement work that can be done by non-experts is often simple papers like this that are feasible to do within PhD studies, even when like measurement isn't your main focus or the thrust of what you want your thesis to be about, is to put one or two extra measures in there that you think, well, they're redundant, they're the same thing, right? And check, are they? Because so much measurement work boils down to assumptions that don't get checked, right? That we could do so early, like, well, this is a robust and stable construct over time. Is it? Test retest studies are actually incredibly rare. It's like page 2 of your measurement book, check internal consistency, check test retest reliability. And we tend to just skip over that page. But those studies are not difficult by and large to do, right? And they add so much. So I think in terms of, concrete steps, there are like two research archetypes that I think can really contribute something substantial to a domain, while not being super a huge investment of time. And at a slightly more complex level, you can maybe bridge this gap that you brought up, Sam, about how do I integrate past research that used different measures across different ICTs, but often we don't just have good norms to say, well, I had a 7 on an AAQ and you had a whatever on a CFQ or on the compact. How do I align those to, so there is even norming studies is another great archetype of work that can provide Rosetta Stones for people to interpret other work. So yeah, I think even maybe just sketching out and making more visible to people, like these are the archetypes of measurement studies, and look how accessible they are for people, would be a great tangible step.
Yeah, it makes me think. Just as we think about these thousands of RCTs, isn't it too bad that we don't have like a really rich just database of all this data that we could go back. If all of that was shared openly, how much we would have to go in and probably actually do some of this measurement work that now is pretty difficult to do because it's just not out there. We haven't had a culture of evaluating that it's just kind of been buried.
I think another paper that I think what might be consistent with the Jingle Jangle paper is the measurement paper by Flake and Fried. I think I like that they all have very catchy names, so they're easy to remember. But I think that's another like more about kind of what I think it's really nice how a lot of people who are motivated to promote meta science provide these very kind of understandable, accessible steps for doing it. Like they've made like in terms of stimulus control, I feel like they've tried to make it really easy, even though it seems very intimidating too.
Jason, you had something I think you wanted to share earlier, or I saw you unmuted yourself.
Oh, I was just going to add briefly on to what Ian said about measurement. I don't know if we want to move on to other domains, perhaps, but you know, if we're going totally mercenary on this, like, because one of the criticisms of open science sometimes is that people will say that it'll impede your career if you use open science practices, which my sense is that's may have been more true in the past, but my sense is that that's becoming less and less of an issue. And in fact, more and more departments are valuing people who use open science, and so you may actually have a leg up if you actually practice open science, because that can be part of your criteria for evaluation, depending upon at least the department you're in. And but one of the things about, I think, measurement is that the papers are relatively quick and easy to write, but at least my experience is those things get cited a lot. If you want like the highest ratio of work to number of citations, do measurement. Like, and you could produce a lot of papers every year and get tons of citations on those articles. And I think for a grad student, that would be a really smart thing to do if you're purely just trying to think about your career. As long as you weren't like trying to be an NIH funded person, it's not going to help there. But if that's not your route, that would be a great avenue, just from that perspective of like getting tenure. Another thing, just from a practical perspective, I would say is like some of the newer measures, because they've been created recently and have been more carefully created, are superior to the older established measures. So just in general, researchers in CBS should probably be not using the old measures for the most part, and try to pick measures that have been created in the last few years. Generally, at least some of those are a lot better, it's seeming like, in the research than older ones. So people should really be thinking about updating which measures they're using. And I think as a pragmatic aspect, in short run.
It's a great point, Jason.
And I would also love to see people write like some white papers and things like that. What are our best measures? Like, think about bringing together a team of people, write a paper. Like, if we could have a paper that said, we evaluated all these measures, general measures of psychological flexibility, and we think these are the 6 best measures in these 6 areas that currently exist. Use those in your studies if you're not going to pick like a domain specific, diabetes AAQ or something. Like, those would be great papers that could really help out a lot of scientists. And again, we get tons of citations if you could bring together a group to write that, do some kind of group science.
That sort of speaks too to like the larger systemic factors that might be we can leverage for this, because it does seem like, I think, thinking about the Lear paper on the audit of JCBS open science practices, where a lot of the recommendations from that were sort of like journal policies could be one way to really change the game in promoting open science pre-registration. And you think of sort of like ACBS, and you think, well, is some kind of task force on measurement a possibility? I don't know I'm curious what people's thoughts are about the challenges in mounting such things. I mean, both in terms of journals and policies, but also ACBS writ large.
Maybe I'll throw my hat in to say that, as one of the more junior members here, who's still a postdoc, there is so much vibrancy in the open science kind of movement from early career people. So I think it would be great if we could get top-down involvement from organizations like ACBS. But so much of the gains seen, like what historically has worked in the last decade, is some really grassroots, ideologically driven work by early career people. So who didn't already come up in a system where you did it one way and it benefited you, who instead are like kind of willing to do something different because they think, if it's worth doing right. That's Brian Nozick's phrase about this. So I would love to see that level of support. And I think there have been developments. JCBS and the publications committee in CBS have gone to a lot of work to implement these journal policy changes. And I think it's inescapable that early career, doctoral, PhD, master's students are going to be at least as important in driving these changes, because they're not already kind of in the meat grinder of the system of doing it a way that has worked already, right? Certainly, no one would have told me it will benefit your CV to put a ton of time into critiquing this measure that's like a beloved part of an area of CBS. In fact, people explicitly told me, don't do that. That won't benefit your career and it's not whatever. But it is good for the science. And then I think it actually in some spheres does get recognized. And as you said, Jason, I don't think it is any more this like active career suicide to engage in this type of work. I think it's actually very well rewarded. I have my current postdoc thanks to my involvement in Open Science Twitter explicitly. And in especially, I can speak for the European mainland side of things, it's heading towards being not just beneficial, but like borderline mandatory in a lot of departments to say, a lot of job ads will say, demonstrate your commitment to open science. Like what things of these lists are you doing? So it's definitely driven by early career people. And I think they are getting rewarded for it, right? And when the contingencies are on our side, I think we, all behaviorists in the room know what direction that's pointing. It's going to happen more, not less.
Yeah, I can just speak to our little department here that, I mean, we're going to be hiring this year, and that's certainly like on way up there on my list of things I'm going to be looking for in candidates, so I mean, for any students out there, I think that's exactly right. I think there's going to be more and more of this. Anyone looking for jobs in academics, I think it benefits you to jump into this and get your feet wet, learn about this stuff, and like Ian's saying, to drive it. I mean, I think that really is where so much of the groundswell is coming from, certainly.
That made me think of too, like when interviewing students. So I think Ian and Jason kind of talked about early career people. I think there are some like students applying to grad school who are really into open science. And I get the impression sometimes they're looking for a mentor who supports open science practices. So even from like that direction, I think it's also beneficial. And I can't imagine a student who'd be like, I don't want you because you support open science. Like, I think it can only be good.
But on the flip side, I think you can also get this type of work done if you're a PhD student who cares about this stuff, even if the lab you're in is a little reticent or it's new to them, or they have, it's not yet part of that culture. I mean, there's room for both sides, right? To even to sneak it in almost, and start with things like pre-printing your work. Or definitely, I have worked in labs that were not super open to this at the time, and by the time I left, it was a significant progress. And I think that speaks to just how much early career people can accomplish, right?
And I would really encourage the early career folks to be bold and to the extent that you have the time to take on these kinds of things, to not hesitate to organize groups of people to write important papers, that that do, cross into, different areas and comment on a lot of stuff. So like the paper that Joanna Arch wrote around mediation, it didn't, I don't know how long, I mean, she was the main author on that. I wrote one of the sections, and I don't get the sense that it took her a tremendous amount of time, and the team wasn't real big. But I think it's a really valuable paper, and I think it has a chance of affecting what a lot of people do in their mediational analyses over the next couple decades, because it's probably no one's going to write a paper like that again for a while, and more people will probably point to that as setting some new standards. And so I would really encourage folks, like, I don't think Joanna's super smart and more established, but I think a lot of people could have written that paper quite well. I think any of the people on this panel here probably could have written that paper quite well. If they just brought together people. They could have brought Joanna Arch in it to write the paper. So if be bold, if you have ideas for papers like that you think could kind of change standards in the field around CBS, like you can write it. And if you reach out to people and say, hey, I'm thinking about this paper, are you interested? Like the worst thing that's going to happen is you say, I don't have time. And most of the time, if you're leading it, they're going to be like, sure, I'll toss in my 2 cents because it's only going to take me a little bit, to write part of a section or to do, to edit. And so, they're happy to be on another publication for, a few hours of work. So I'd say, go for it. And, we will start to change the field when we have more of those papers out there that kind of become those touchstones that people reference and say, like, this is how you should be doing it. This is how you should be doing it. And I think it would really help if some of the newer folks could kind of like push that stuff out there. And those are those papers tend to over time get cited a lot, and they're good for your career as well.
I would echo all of those statements. Kind of going back, we mentioned the 1,000 RCTs, 1,000 plus RCTs a second ago. I think within those RCTs there is evidence that folks got better, or indications of depression and anxiety and everything else tended by and large to get better. So even if our measurement is not perfect, there is something about CBS and ACT that I think is beneficial to the points that everyone's been talking about. I would hope that as we continue to conduct our research and improve our research, that we can figure out what those components really are. And if that means, there's a part of me that says, if that means revising aspects of the model, for instance, not saying that this would happen, but what if the hexaflex lost a dimension or added a dimension? If something like that were to happen, would the rest of us be okay, or would we dogmatically say no, it's the hexaflex, it's the 6, right? And so I think, like I said, I think there's something there, and we need to accurately measure what's actually going on. And if we do that, we could perhaps make the interventions even better, the theory better. But that might mean letting go, or at least being flexible enough to change in some way, either letting go or adding aspects to our loved models.
I really hope that the 6 process thing is, toast in not too long. It's just, I was there in lab the Friday that Steve made that up. Like it was the weekend before. He came in the lab and he's like, hey, I came up with this idea over the weekend and I want to just talk to you about it. Like, I think it's kind of neat, and like I just want your feedback. Like, there was a Saturday, like, get this. There was like a Saturday where Steve was sitting around and he got out a piece of paper and he sketched a hexagon and he started thinking of like words that he could put on the points. And then he started to, and then that got rolled out, and that's like in the last 20 years now, that's quote unquote ACT. But like he made it up one day, and now a lot of stuff has been formed around that. But it's really only one way of viewing this. And from our CBS background, we know well that you can chunk the world up in many ways that are helpful. And it's just got to be that this 6 things that Steve made up one weekend isn't the best. There's got to be some improvements we can make on that. And so, I mean, maybe not, but I would hope with science that we start to see sort of some shifts of like holding on as strongly as it seems like happens. There's lots of reasons for that are not really scientific ones, that are more pragmatic and about dissemination and other things. But I guess I would hope that we can hold that stuff lightly and be able to break it up when necessary.
It's a really good point, and I think sort of here in these last 7 minutes, I feel like we've hit a lot of the things that I really wanted to touch on here. But one thing that we haven't talked as much about is the sort of transition to the movement of process-based therapy, and how in many ways there's been some that have speculated that perhaps the field is moving a little bit too fast, and that a lot of the work hasn't really been examined. And I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts on that and what we can do perhaps differently to prevent some of the issues that have happened in the last 2 decades with measurement, open science, all of that stuff.
I could just say something to that, because I don't know if I think it's moving too fast necessarily. In some ways, I mean, maybe in some ways, in other ways not. But I think PBT as like a concept, at its heart, at its core, what I believe in it, like what I like about it, is getting at Jason's point. You know, like, can this be something that's a bit more flexible? That when maybe there are different dimensions we haven't thought of, or different ways to think about this. And I hope that it doesn't turn into the same thing of like, this is what it is and what it has to be. It feels like it has potential to not be that, to be more flexible, and something that we're developing and adding to and revising over time. So maybe it's almost a second chance. I just hope maybe we don't squander it. I don't know how we do that, but it does, for me right now, where I'm at currently, I find I have a lot of optimism.
I think another element to add to Eric's point is maybe like kind of continuing to grow like a willingness to self-reflect and criticize or critique, and then be willing to change in response to it. I think kind of there might be a lot of like pressure to not do, like I think Ian said explicitly, people told him not to do certain things. And so I think if we can kind of, you know, as a community, like kind of agree, like we're willing to reflect, I think that would be helpful in terms of, so for example, like, you know, PBT has the EAM, and if we reify that, then we run into the same problem as the hexaflex, which is, this is what it is. So I think some people talk about learning our lessons, so maybe we can apply that. That would be nice. And so, for example, like Ian's papers on the IRAP, I found really enlightening because I think they did exactly that. And I've benefited a lot from reading about these issues because I didn't know that much about it, but someone had to say it, because if not, it's like, oh, right, it's correct or it's good. So I think that would be one thing that would be good.
I myself am very excited about the developments with PBT. At the same time, I hope that how we go about validating the incremental benefit of it is done in a way that is valid. And what I mean by that is, I remember I was, you can go on YouTube and you can see conference talks from, you know, the founders of you know, Steve and, you know, Stefan, and I was watching one of those where they're talking about PBT, and if you scroll through the comments on one of them, one of the comments was somebody had said like, well, I practice Adlerian therapy and I don't get how this would ever help me. And I, you know, whoever said that, like, who knows, but I think there's an element of that where it's like, the ultimate goal is reducing human suffering, right? It's having better practices. I hope that beyond just showing another way of doing the same thing, which sometimes feels like, oh, this is, you know, therapy is therapy. Maybe just talking is the mechanism of change in talk therapy. I hope that we can show with PBT that it is increment, that there is something there, and if there's not, that we can adjust it accordingly.
Ian and Jason, I'd love to hear your thoughts about PBT as we kind of near the end here. But I think this is really a relevant.
To use Rob Zettle's phrase, I'll be the skunk at the barbecue here. I'm less optimistic, not about the broad descriptive principles of PBT, not about the idea that we should focus on like ideographic individuals, like, EMA techniques, great, individual level stuff, great. But we are the same people doing it. We are inheriting the research practices from before. So one of the reasons I think it is worth interrogating the work to date is because it is the same research community, often the same individuals who are going to do the new work that did the old work. And every time that I'm playing meta science Jenga of taking a publication off the shelf and pushing that a block here or a block there to see how steady is the tower, without fail, it has kind of come tumbling down. Whether that's like taking a look at a measure as a whole and saying, this really seems shaky on multiple fronts, or I haven't put it out yet, but taking specific publications related to the early days of bridging RFT and ACT and PBT like things and nudging a few bricks to see what happens, I keep ending up with Jenga bricks all over the floor. So until we know how to right the ship in a historical sense, I would be wary of anything that we do in the future of just repeating the same mistakes. And that's not that, like, PBT is exciting, but it's dangerous because it's exciting, right? You can get lost in the moment, to get swept up with the excitement. But if you look at the broader meta-scientific literature, we are still not good at developing research processes that can clearly discriminate between, true falses, effects that are just not the case. Things like precognition and being able to see the future, where all of this started in 2011 with Darrell Bem's paper, to say it violates causality. It cannot be the case. Humans cannot tell the future. And yet I keep detecting significant effects. So something is wrong with our methods. And when we can't do the really simple stuff right, not that I'm saying it's all wrong or anything, but there are structural weaknesses in our research process that we need to address for any of it to produce really meaningful results. So obviously everyone has their own interests and which part of it they want to focus on. But until I felt that the process, the structures in general produce meaningful truths, although without getting ontological about it, I am suspect of anything that comes from those processes. So I would say, let's right the ship in terms of what we have been doing before we take off in an exciting new direction, or we'll be here in 20 more years saying, I wish that Steve and Stefan hadn't on a Friday or Saturday come up with this, and now we're all stuck with it in the same way as we are now.
Yeah, I love that comment. I mean, I think one of the things that the sort of CBS world has always been fantastic at is innovation and kind of coming up with new and novel and interesting ideas. I think we're not a community on the whole that's as good at winnowing the wheat from the chaff. We are good at generating novelty, but we're not so good at figuring out what aspect of that novelty is the most useful. And we kind of have a tendency to let's kind of keep creating new stuff. I think that's true in science in general, but I actually think that's even more true in the CBS world. And probably, to a certain extent, that has to do with historical reasons of, we were new, we were the little kids on the block, and we needed to sort of establish our place. So we just had to sort of push into all these areas and generate a lot of new stuff. But I feel like this, just my opinion, I think the general need in the meta-science community of just recognizing we need to kind of clean up our house and really focus on that. I think that's just true in science in many ways. In psychological science, we're really seeing that. But I think there's even maybe some more truth for that for CBS as well, because we've sort of expanded so fast. We've been so creative. We've created so much stuff. And I think maybe we need to enter kind of a period of more circumspect, kind of looking at ourselves, looking at our practices, really reflecting and trying to see, can we replicate these effects? This was, something we've been seeing. Well, how about let's see some more replication studies to see if those things really hold up when they're done in a different lab, and or what are the boundary conditions of that, and not be so interested in trying to expand into yet a new measure or yet a new this or that, a new domain or a new like subclass of this group of people, but rather try to see if we can really get a sense of like, what is it that works? What is it that's effective? And focus more on that replication and our practices, and engage in really good scientific practices and try and clean that up.
Well spoken, and well spoken from all of you. I sincerely appreciated everyone's thoughts on these issues. I think we balanced very nicely sort of an overview of a lot of the issues that are coming up, but also kind of an eye to the future and things that can be done to right the ship, so to speak. So with that, we are at our hour. So I'm going to stop recording and thank the audience for their rapt attention. And